There's nothing to see. I used to live here, you know.
You're gonna die here, you know. Convenient.
Star Wars came out in 1977 and was a huge hit, proving science fiction films didn't have to look cheap and cheesy. The Empire Strikes Back came out in 1980 and proved sequels didn't have to be terrible rehashes. And if you wanted to dispel the notion of similar things coming in threes,
I suppose I got hotwire this thing.
here is Return of the Jedi.
I have a really bad feeling about this.
Star Wars Episode 6 Return of the Jedi saw George Lucas wrapping up his trilogy of Star Wars films. Whereas he'd estimated he had enough story to make 9 films,
Everybody gets delusions of grandeur.
by the end of the third film, Lucas had become so tired with the whole endeavour that he tied everything up with a very neat bow. A bow that he and others would need to undo at a much later date. Of course, the usual caveats apply to the numbering system of Star Wars films. Episode 6 was the third one made. Episode 3 would be the 6th one made. So that means the second was 5th, the 4th was 1st, the 1st was one better than 3rd, and yet somehow Attack of the Clones was both the 5th, the 2nd, and somehow also the last.
I don't think the system works.
Some of what's discussed here is also mentioned in our other Star Wars videos, so if you've been watching them all together and don't need to hear something again, just use the chapters or timestamps in the description to skip ahead. Though, of course, if you've perhaps had a recent head injury which has affected your short-term memory, then never mind. Also, while there's a tendency to lionize the entirety of the original trilogy, Return of the Jedi, for me at least, has always been very much the least of those 3 movies.
I wonder if your feelings on this matter are clear.
On Star Wars productions, George Lucas wore many hats, or in his case, beards. He was a writer, a director, a producer, an editor, but by the time of this third film, he was also the head of a large company, Lucasfilm. George Lucas had, in theory, hung up his director's beard, and now insisted on only wearing the writer's beard, along with his very expensive producer's beard. He wanted to make his films his way, and ideally in a way that was going to be less stressful on him. Things would not turn out that way.
Why didn't you tell me?
We'll cut the story recap to the bare minimum here. The 3 L's, that's Luke, Leia, and Lando, along with Chewie and the droids, rescue Han from Jabba the Hutt.
How we doing?
Same as always.
That bad, huh?
Luke visits a dying Yoda.
Leia's my sister.
Luke has discovered that Leia is his sister and that Ben lied about his father's death and that, did you hear, Leia was his sister. The Emperor's inspecting the construction of a second Death Star and the rebels want to knock it out by destroying a shield on the moon of Endor. The Emperor wants Luke as a new apprentice while Luke thinks Vader can be redeemed. Luke decides to hand himself in, with the belief that his father, that should read, mass-murdering father Anakin Skywalker still has some good in him. One does wonder if any surviving dinosaurs would have ever written a redemption arc for the comet.
What's going on?
I don't know.
Also, this Emperor is one sarcastic twat.
I'm afraid the deflector shield will be quite operational.
Before he heads off, Luke drops a bombshell on Leia,
My sister.
who's initially horrified, but then she horrifies us.
I've always known.
Luke's battle with Vader ends with Luke paying back Dad for the severed hand, but that's when the Emperor starts with his party trick. Force lightning is a power that neither Vader or Luke have, but they obviously weren't paying attention to the Emperor, where he rubs his sneakers on the carpet before giving everybody a massive shock. Vader, of course, had enough of this shit back when he was a kid on Tatooine, and throws Big Daddy Palps down a near bottomless shaft, where he will never, ever, 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 ever be seen or heard from again, where he will never, not even somehow, return. Ah, shit.
It is you who are mistaken.
The rebels on Endor meet the Ewoks, Lando and Wedge blow up the Death Star too, and then everybody joins a celebration with the Ewoks. Of course, the newly redeemed Anakin Skywalker joins Ben and Yoda as a Force ghost, where they'll share an apartment in the Netherworld, forever bickering over who has the top bunk.
Then the Emperor has already won.
It's a simple plot, but I have some thoughts.
Thanks for coming after me. Now I owe you one.
Han Solo has a number of attributes. He's a charming rogue, a smuggler, a reluctant hero, but obviously mathematician is not one of them.
That's 2 you owe me, Junior.
I mean, 1, 2, -1. Or maybe he just calculates that his own skin is worth so much more than Luke's that it takes several Luke rescues to equal one Han rescue. I mean, that's quite an attitude from some gold bricker who's been living it up in a carbonite resort for the last few months.
It's a trap!
Return of the Jedi's May 1983 release marked the point where, at least as far as George Lucas was concerned, Star Wars was effectively done as an ongoing franchise. Merchandise would be released for a few years after the film's theatrical run, there were animated series and a pair of Ewok-based kids movies, but Lucas's plans to make any more films were on indefinite hold, which is much like what happens when you try to make a claim on an extended warranty. With a child to raise and an impending divorce, George Lucas wasn't in too much of a hurry to do any more Star Wars films. But let's be kind and rewind to 1979, where the earliest plans for a third Star Wars film started to come together. There were three separate strands of planning: the business side, the story, and of course, production. The trick, of course, was to get these three strands to play nicely together and coalesce, rather than congeal like a microwaved lasagna.
But he asked the impossible.
In the mid-70s, George Lucas had grand plans for a huge science fiction saga based on his love of old serials, a sprawling epic that would fill dozens of yellow legal pads. When he finally found a studio interested in bankrolling his science fiction epic, he decided to pare down his vision to just one smaller part of the story, something that came somewhere in the middle. When Star Wars was an unexpectedly massive hit, George Lucas revived the idea of making more chapters of his story, which in his mind would be around 9 films. Which is of course 9 films more than was ever made of my planned saga, Crack, Smash and Be in the Golden Polo Mallet of Tumbancar.
It's not like that at all.
Lucas wanted to tell his story, but he didn't really want the pain in the beard of directing, so for the first sequel he hired Irvin Kershner, who made a beautiful film with very good performances. But Empire Strikes Back took longer to shoot than Lucas would have liked. George Lucas also wanted the studio to have less involvement, and so he attempted to self-finance Empire, but scheduling and budget blowouts ended with 20th Century Fox having more leverage over Lucasfilm. The Empire Strikes Back had been another big hit, but it wasn't quite as big as the first Star Wars film had been. That first movie's box office performance was like being pummeled repeatedly by Red Sox fans wielding baseball bats because you sat in the wrong part of the stadium, while Empire's performance was more akin to falling down a long flight of stairs after a night on the sauce. George Lucas and Lucasfilm engaged in drawn-out negotiations with Fox over the financing and distribution of a third Star Wars film. Lucas also consolidated his various companies so that they were nearer his new home base in Marin County to the north of San Francisco. While parts of Skywalker Ranch were still some years away from completion, Lucas wanted to build a temporary audio facility to mix sound for his films and avoid having to commute to Los Angeles during post-production. Industrial Light and Magic was in its awkward teenage phase, where the company was now producing effects for non-Star Wars films. They'd work on Lucasfilm's Raiders of the Lost Ark, but they'd also create effects for outside productions like E.T., Poltergeist, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and Dragon Slayer. With so many projects splintering the team, ILM, like much of Lucas's burgeoning empire, needed much more effective time management than throwing darts at a 1983 wall calendar. There was also the massively profitable merchandising arm of the company, the nascent computer animation division that would eventually be known as Pixar, a games division later known as LucasArts, and of course other Lucas companies who worked on developing systems for digitally editing audio and video. The only thing missing from this empire was Lucas Dance, a division concentrating on bringing tap and jazz ballet to a galaxy near you.
We have top men working on it right now.
Lucasfilm's negotiations with Fox over a distribution deal took some time to hammer out an agreement that both parties felt that they could agree to. There were major issues such as who owned what and how much of that they owned, who had sequel rights, who had remake rights, who had what percentage of merchandising rights, that sort of thing. And then there were smaller things like when Fox could start selling broadcast rights to the movies.
Oh, yeah, well.
Lucasfilm wanted to keep Star Wars off television until a few years after the third film's release to protect theatrical releases and lucrative re-releases, while Fox knew the value of television rights. The parties eventually agreed to hold off on selling the first film to US television until 1984. Other countries, though, would see Star Wars hit television sooner, as was the case where I lived, where Star Wars debuted on local telly in 1982. I do recall that night very well, with me and my brother recording it off-air with our behemoth Sanyo VCR, where we paused and unpaused the recording to edit out the commercial breaks. Of course, we forgot to unpause on the last break and lost the medallion ceremony. Star Wars would finally hit home video in 1982, this time with the medallion ceremony intact. Unless, of course, you bought our bootleg.
Maybe you'd like it back in your cell, Your Highness.
As a personal note, I do understand why the television rights were a big deal, because you did reach a lot of people who didn't necessarily go to see movies in a cinema. When I was in school, sometime before Star Wars did make it to television, our class needed to name teams for some project or other, and a vote was taken. The girls engaged in tactical voting and went for Black Beauty, while the boys voted overwhelmingly for Battlestar Galactica over Star Wars, since they'd all seen that on television and not everybody had seen Star Wars at that point. With TV broadcasts, you would reach a much more passive audience, but a much bigger audience. Lucasfilm, for its part, was more worried about people skipping the latest entry in theatres because they could get their Star Wars fix at home for free. The issue of who was going to direct the third film also needed attention. With Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, there were no credits at the start of the film, only a title card. There was a credit for Lucasfilm, which by association implied George Lucas, but all of the individual credits were at the end of the movie. The Directors Guild of America didn't like this and censured Lucas by fining Kirshner. The Writers Guild also took issue with the credit placement, which led to George Lucas resigning from both organisations. There's a suggestion that Kirshner's slower pace of working had frustrated George Lucas while he was wearing his producer's beard. Kirshner, for his part, was keen on doing something else. Either way, the search was on for a new director, with candidates mainly being people who were either not members of the DGA, as in people who usually worked outside of the US, or people who would leave the DGA just to direct a Star Wars film.
Oh, what a mess.
It got down to two final candidates, David Lynch and Richard Marquand. David Lynch was finally offered the job, but he would quickly turn it down in part because Lynch didn't necessarily want to make a George Lucas movie. But he would soon get the chance to put his own stamp on a big-budget science fiction epic with Dune. Lucas then offered the job to British director Richard Marquand, figuring he had a good visual eye, and perhaps he'd be a little bit more amenable to George Lucas's suggestions than a more established director. The film was penciled in for a 1983 release, but at this time there wasn't much of a story outside of the dusty old notes made by George Lucas in the mid-70s. George Lucas was so determined that Return of the Jedi would be a smoothly run production that actors were cast, studios were booked, locations booked, models made, costumes designed, all before the script was actually finished. To get things rolling, Lucas had very quick meetings with concept artists, including Ralph McQuarrie, whose earliest paintings had helped sell the first movie to the studio. Lucas, wearing his writer's beard, would throw out a few rough ideas such as a grassy part of Tatooine, a grotesquely slug-like Jabba the Hutt, as well as various creatures, including the short forest dwellers, the Ewoks as they were originally known. The production scouted potential locations, mainly in the US. Interiors would again be shot in Britain at Elstree Studios. But of course, there was still the need for a proper script. George Lucas had always intended to bring in another writer, but he wasn't sure if he could get Lawrence Kasdan to return, now that he had started directing features. Kasdan, who'd already written Raiders of the Lost Ark and Empire Strikes Back, did return. But by now, he had to deal with George Lucas, who'd formed part of the film in his head, based partly on his old notes, partly on the concept art that was coming in, and partly on budget practicalities. There was a big question as to whether or not Harrison Ford would return.
Good luck.
Part of why Han was frozen and Lando was introduced in Empire Strikes Back was as a contingency in case Harrison Ford did not want to return. There was good reason to believe that. He'd never been all that complimentary about George Lucas's dialogue, and by now his movie career had started to take off. Ford signed on anyway, and the reason he didn't pass is probably fairly simple.
You're throwing away a fortune here. Don't be a fool!
Lando has also got very little to do apart from fly the Falcon and not much else. Leia's role is to lay about in a steel bikini and say nothing, while later she has to process the fact that she has a brother, and then has to process the fact that she has a habit of kissing said brother. Han spends a big part of the film recovering from temporary blindness, and then most of his time on Endor has him thinking he's a third wheel. Vader's now quite open about his family history and will eventually redeem himself, though at no point does he ever trot out,
"I was murdering younglings since before you were born, son."
In Lucas's original outlines for his grand saga, he'd had the idea of a battle in a forest with Wookiees using primitive weapons. He revived the idea for Return of the Jedi, but by now the Wookiees had been shown to be quite technologically advanced, and so the Wookiees became the Ewoks. The Ewoks weren't just Wookiees whose parents smoked, they were happily living in their treehouses until the Empire showed up. As various concepts were worked on, Lucas kept pushing for cuter and cuter designs, where they would kill the audience with cuteness.
I'm taking care of everything.
Oh, great.
The original plot outlines were much more sprawling than the final film, with more locations, including a section set on an early version of what would later be known as Coruscant. And at various points, there were multiple Death Stars. Jolly useful having multiple Death Stars. You could have a Death Star for commuting during the week, and then a second weekend Death Star near an ocean planet so you could go for a swim.
What?
However, all of this was shaping up to be very expensive, and when Lucas wore his producer's beard, he started combining storylines and locations to the point where the bulk of the film's action takes place on Tatooine, Endor, and in and around the Death Star, and about half of that is in some sort of throne room. The Empire Strikes Back had started with a much smaller budget than the $32 or so million that it had eventually cost, and George Lucas was determined that Jedi would be made much more efficiently, and so he set the budget for Return of the Jedi at $32 million. A lot of planned sequences were jettisoned in order to keep the budget from heading north faster than Santa heading home for Christmas Eve beer o'clock. George Lucas realized that a second Death Star was repetitious, but he admitted as much at the time. However, he also admitted that he just didn't have a better idea that wasn't either going to make the plot more unwieldy or cause the budget to blow out.
But I do believe they think I am some sort of god.
There were debates along the way. Which character should play a larger part? Should Ben do something other than be a nightlight? Should Yoda die? Should Lando die? Should Ben come back to life and die again? For his part, Lucas didn't want anybody to die, while Lawrence Kasdan felt he needed to kill somebody, so it might as well be that old bastard Yoda. Lucas wanted to make a film that was enjoyable for 9-year-olds and one that was uplifting and positive for everyone else. Apart from the dead Ewoks.
I wish I had your confidence.
How much of every post-Star Wars Episode 4 project came from Lucas's original outlines from the mid-70s, and how much was new? There are elements that changed very little from what he'd written on those yellow legal pads, and some things that, for various practical reasons, were created during the scripting process. While discussing Anakin Skywalker's backstory in script conferences with Kasdan and Marquand, Lucas, wearing his plot beard, would basically recount the story beats that would eventually form the basis of Revenge of the Sith. Lucas understood the history of these characters better than anyone else. But the counterpoint is, despite coming up with terms like lightsaber, in his heart of hearts, these things were always laser swords. George Lucas's first title for the film was Return of the Jedi. But when Lawrence Kasdan called it, and I'm paraphrasing here, a weak source title, Lucas thought about it and changed the name to Revenge of the Jedi. Logos were prepared and some early merchandise was produced. And then Lucas changed his mind again. People were writing him that Jedis really weren't about vengeance, the film's story was actually about Luke redeeming his father, and revenge sounded a little like some of the early titles that were being used for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Lucas eventually agreed and switched back to Return of the Jedi. The change came quite late in the day, where companies like Kenneth would have to destroy a lot of packaging with what had been the right title but it was now the wrong title. However, any of the merchandise with the earlier title is now worth an awful lot of money. I dig. I still make a mint from selling t-shirts with this channel's original skateboarding-focused title. As of late 1982, the film's official title, Star Wars Episode 6: Return of the Jedi.
The other he spoke of is your twin sister.
Filming began in early 1982 at Elstree Studios in the UK, with the difficult sandstorm scene being the first scenes to be shot. It was a difficult shoot, with the fake sand causing a lot of trouble for the cast and crew. But that's the thing about sand. It's coarse, it's rough, and it gets everywhere. Security had become an issue for Star Wars films. Actors were only given scenes that they were in, certain revelations were withheld from the cast until a late date, and when the production reconvened in Arizona for the Tatooine sequences, the production was shot under a fake title, Blue Harvest: Horror Beyond Imagination. This also made sense, as whenever the production office approached somebody about working on a Star Wars movie,
I got an idea.
Prices and fees quickly became inflated.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
The main cast carried over. Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Billy D. Williams, Frank Oz as Yoda, Sir Alec Guinness, Anthony Daniels, Peter Mayhew, Kenny Baker, Jeremy Bulloch, Dave Prowse and James Earl Jones as Darth Vader, and fresh off of his triumph as Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford.
I love you.
I know.
Many of the headline cast had their own concerns about their roles before Lucas and Kasdan had finished the scripts. Alec Guinness hated that Obi-Wan was just a Force ghost shot against black velvet, and so in Return of the Jedi, he was slightly more mobile and more corporeal than before. Mark Hamill wanted Luke to have a relationship with a woman, and ideally somebody who didn't also send Father's Day cards to the same address as he did. Carrie Fisher was tired of Leia being a tomboy. Well, they fixed that. Harrison Ford just wanted Han Solo to die, though he'd later note dead Han Solo toys wouldn't sell half as well.
Okay. I told you it was gonna work.
The Ewoks were filled out by various little people and children, including young Warrick Davis. His Ewok became front and centre when Kenny Baker, who'd been pulling double duty as R2 and an Ewok, was indisposed. Boba Fett ended up as Boba Splat, mainly because Lucas was disappointed in how the character had turned out.
The Emperor's made a critical error and the time for our attack has come.
There are also supporting roles for UK-based actors Kenneth Colley.
It's an older code, sir, but it checks out.
Michael Pennington.
I need more men.
Carolyn Blakiston as Mon Mothma.
Many Bothans died.
And Dermot Crowley as General Justin Bieber, Crix Maydeen.
Is your strike team assembled?
Sebastian Shaw played what was left of Anakin Skywalker, and Denis Lawson as Wedge finally got to meet the other cast members.
Much like your father.
And then there was the film's villain, Ian McDiarmid as the Emperor, the wizened dictator of the universe. Later on in the prequels, we'd see his machinations manipulating galactic events so he could swipe aside the galaxy's democratic system in favour of the Emperor controlling everything. Vader in this is his lapdog, without much of the ambition that he had displayed in Empire Strikes Back. Look, we've all had bosses like that, the ones who wear you down to a nub while dangling a promotion. Or perhaps Vader was just sucking up to the tyrant, waiting for his moment. This dude is old and wizened and probably shits himself.
Yes, I know.
How long could this grotesque mockery of a human being hang on for? Though, in the end, Vader just says, screw it. One of the film's highlights was the array of aliens on Tatooine. In contrast, Empire Strikes Back had far fewer aliens than the original Star Wars movie. In Jedi, there would be a hell of a lot more aliens of all types, from giant creatures like the Rancor or the Sarlacc to little salacious crumb. While the plot was being hammered out, teams in both the US and Britain were creating all manner of creatures, with their actual characters and story function being decided long after they'd been designed, almost like picking softball teams at the company picnic. Oh, that brings back memories of softball. I wish you'd pick me as goalkeeper.
You can see here the Death Star orbiting the forest moon of Endor.
It's almost like an episode of The Muppet Show in terms of the variety of characters, as well as the number of them that were originally realised as puppets. Cy Snootles was a puppet whose limbs were attached by rods to a performer under the set.
Our cruisers can't repel firepower of that magnitude.
Admiral Akbar was a controversial choice to lead the rebel fleet, possibly because somebody had very bad seafood allergies. In long shots, Akbar was an actor in a costume, but close-ups used elaborate puppets. Lando's co-pilot Nien Nunb was also a puppet. Puppetry ain't so bad. I'm actually a partially animatronic puppet controlled by an operator underneath me. It's not so bad for me, but the puppeteer gets a burnt scalp every time I take a sip of coffee.
When 900 years old you reach, look as good you will not.
Frank Oz returned for the short scenes involving Yoda, where the new puppet produced by sculptor Stuart Freeborn was delivered very close to shooting dates and didn't work 100%, which did lead to some scenes needing to be reshot later on. And of course, there was also Jabba the Hutt.
Oh, Judah.
Jabba was originally meant to be a more upright creature in the original film, but when the special effects proved to be too painful to deal with, the scene was cut. For Jedi, Hutt was reimagined as a giant slug-like gangster in the vein of characters played by Sidney Greenstreet in old film noir thrillers. Jabba was almost a Roman galley, with 3 operators inside the body, moving the face, the arms, the tail, as well as other crew outside the puppet, operating animatronics. I do wonder how that works on your filmography. One might assume having the entry Jabba's tongue operator on your resume sounds like it might not open as many doors as you would have hoped for.
Doesn't sound so bad.
The giant Rancor was the subject of much toing and froing. Was it going to be a man in a suit or a stop-motion puppet? Lucas disliked the idea of stop-motion due to the unreal motion, but ILM had made some breakthroughs with their work on Dragon Slayer. Go Motion put small motors in the puppet so that when each frame was exposed, the puppet moved slightly, leading to smoother motion. Compare the motion of the walkers in Empire Strikes Back to the chicken walkers in Jedi. For the Rancor, Lucas was keen on something closer to Godzilla, a man in a suit. And puppeteer Phil Tippett, who led the US-based creature design efforts, built a suit. But George Lucas wasn't satisfied with test footage.
Second thought, let's pass on that, huh?
However, time was running out, so effects supervisor Denis Murin's solution was also rather old school, a rod puppet.
That is the way of things.
The special effects in Return of the Jedi are very ambitious. The number of fighters and Star Destroyers in the Rebel attack sequence is huge, almost to the point where it's too much.
There's too many of them.
Production techniques had progressed markedly since the first film, leading to little quality loss from so many composited images on one piece of film. There had been a long-standing rumour of a sneaker visible in one shot. I have long since stopped looking for it, though in the special edition it's now a jet ski. One of the other major effects challenges was one that was perhaps simpler in concept but still became one of the film's signature scenes, the speeder bike chase. To give a sense of immense speed, background plates were shot in multiple ways, with cameras on tracks, or a camera was mounted on a Steadicam operated by the rig's inventor Garrett Brown while walking very slowly through a forest with a camera set to shoot at a very low frame rate, but with longer than usual exposures. When played back at 24 frames per second, it looked as though the backgrounds were whizzing by at speed. A mix of model work and blue screen brought the sequence to life, and it goes without saying, the toys were pretty cool too. Location work always carried with it challenges. Some early shots of Tatooine were filmed in Death Valley. George Lucas wanted dunes. So did his first choice of director. The location ultimately chosen for their sand dunes was in Yuma, Arizona, though it was only much later that the production team realized that sand dunes were very much like decisions of the indecisive, subject to constant change. The Sarlacc pit was one of those small problems that became a huge problem. Digging a hole in the desert is one thing, assuming the wind doesn't blow the sand away, and so the pit became a man-made raised section of the desert. A large section of Jabba's sail barge was built on location, despite it not necessarily being needed for very long. And despite the effort, it was in fact a miniature that was blown up in the end, since they intended to recycle the wood, and because Arizona apparently had no need of 4 billion matchsticks in the desert. The Endor locations at Grizzly Creek near Crescent City in Northern California had various problems, mainly to do with rain, but in general it was a far less problematic shoot.
Keep your distance though, Chewie, but don't look like you're trying to keep your distance.
As director, Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope had been a draining experience for George Lucas. He would delegate Empire Strikes Back to Irvin Kershner, but Lucas would find that he would have less control when things started to run away.
I can't do it, Ben.
Jedi was meant to be different. George Lucas had organised his films in a way that would make his life easier. He had consolidated his business units, the US-based locations meant less travel for him and less chance of costs running away with them. He had a relatively fresh director who, in theory, should have made it easier for Lucas to achieve what he wanted without being on set every day. Except the production didn't run as smoothly as it was supposed to. To some who knew him, George Lucas seemed even more withdrawn towards the end of production. He was a new dad, and he was soon to be a divorced single dad. Richard Marquand rubbed at least some of the cast and crew the wrong way, and concerned producer Howard Kazanjian told Lucas that he should stick around London for the entire shoot rather than just a few weeks at the start. George Lucas had intended just to direct second unit footage, but he'd often remain on the main set.
We shall double our efforts.
It's possible that Richard Marquand, having been hired to work on the largest franchise in the world, believed he was now the biggest director in the world. However, working with George Lucas hovering over his shoulder would quickly deflate some of the director's notions as to his actual status. Marquand had a reputation as a director who worked well with actors and a film crew, but he'd not been someone who'd worked extensively with special effects, and here was a movie that involved the odd special effect, or 600. Marquand preferred working with 2 cameras, while George Lucas insisted on a third, despite the difficulties that would produce for camera operators and lighting. I mean, I guess if 3 cameras worked for I Love Lucy, it should work for Star Wars, but at no point was there any suggestion that the film should open with this: Star Wars was filmed in front of a live studio audience. What Lucas wanted was coverage, more footage from different angles that would give him options when wearing his editor's beard. Jedi's principal photography amounted to 88 days, which was substantially less than what was needed for Empire Strikes Back. But things would still be tight during post-production. Sound designer Ben Bird had been collecting sounds for the movie and languages for the various aliens. And John Williams was impatiently tapping on his piano in 7/8 time, waiting for some finished reels so he could work on the score. All through this, ILM was in the usual mad panic, where they had to generate a staggering number of effect shots in the time they had left. At one point, George Lucas cut dozens of completed shots and ordered new scenes. There were major scenes needing attention and small matters requiring some work. Things like an animated splodge to cover up the lighting rig for the Emperor's face. After principal photography wrapped, there were still inserts to be shot, mainly with doubles. Things like close-ups of items to help clarify story points. At one point, George Lucas wondered out loud, what the hell happened to Vader's body? And then very quickly, he shot scenes of a funeral pyre. Anything that could tie the plot together and answer viewer questions was probably fixed with an insert. And then, if it was extraneous, it was cut. One such scene was Luke assembling a lightsaber in a cave on Tatooine.
When we find Jabba the Hutt and that bounty hunter, we'll contact you.
I'll meet you at the rendezvous point on Tatooine.
Of course, If we put on our pedant's beard, we'd have to ask what happened between Empire and Jedi.
Lando Calrissian and poor Chewbacca never returned from this awful place.
Excluding supplementary media like books and comics and whatever, how much time elapsed between the two films? It seems to be somewhere between 6 to 12 months. So why did it take so long to get to Tatooine to rescue Han from Jabba the Hutt? Also, Luke's become a Jedi in his own time, but he didn't go back to finish his training from Yoda. Look, I shouldn't complain. I started to learn to play the guitar and took a few weeks of lessons, but then I stopped to go play in a band. But that didn't end so well because I couldn't really play. So I spent some time teaching myself, and then after a while I went back to visit my guitar teacher, who had since retired since business was so bad after all of his students quit after a few lessons. That was really awkward. And that's when it hit me. That's when I knew my future path, playing bass. The director's first cut did not go over fantastically well, but George Lucas always knew his films would come together, if they came together, during the editing process.
Just images, really.
Marquand's editor, Sean Barton, along with George Lucas, Duane Dunham, and Lucas's soon-to-be ex-wife Marcia Lucas, recut the film. Part of that re-editing process was to find takes where Luke wasn't so angry.
Luke, don't talk that way.
Now, you would be angry too if the girl of your dreams turned out to be your sister, that your dad had cut off your hand and also turned out to be a mass murderer who also tortured his daughter and your best friend and then tried to get you to join his cult.
Join me on the dark side of the Force.
George and Marcia Lucas had begun divorce proceedings. They'd just adopted a daughter, and after the ordeal of getting Jedi made, George Lucas was ready to just be a dad. He'd briefly considered dumping the entire franchise onto Fox.
I can't do it, R2.
But in the end, Star Wars would have to wait for George Lucas to rekindle his love of filmmaking. He would produce other people's films or have people come in to direct films for him, people like Steven Spielberg on Indiana Jones and Ron Howard on Willow. You can also tell with Lucas's next production, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that he was working through some stuff. Some people would just go and buy a fancy new flannel and a Lamborghini, but Lucas scared the shit out of a generation of young fans.
Instead of a big dark blur, I see a big light blur.
We've often talked about the idea that if you saw something as a kid and liked it, then for a lot of people that opinion will hold fast forever. So I do remember seeing Return of the Jedi in the cinema as a kid, where at the time I was very immersed in the world of Star Wars. But after seeing Jedi, I just found it to be okay. Good rather than great. I don't really remember what I specifically felt was lacking, only that it just wasn't on the same level as the first two films. Maybe I was miffed because it was a fairly definitive ending with no new films on the horizon. Star Wars had been the biggest thing since sliced bread, which itself was the biggest thing since unsliced bread, and with no new films to look forward to, Star Wars being a big thing was no longer a thing. Indeed, I recall being mocked at school in 1985 for still liking Star Wars. And I was mocked by a kid who went to a school dance dressed as Darth Vader 2 years earlier. Also, fuck you, Vaughn.
Here we go again.
Sales of merch dropped off to nothing and people moved on to other things. Space movies and television series would soon disappear almost entirely for a very long time, with really only Star Trek needing to poke holes in sheets of black cardboard to simulate stars. Return of the Jedi was, for a very long time, the only film of the original Star Wars trilogy that I'd only ever seen in a theatre once. That was back when it was released in 1983. Though many years later, I did see the film in a concert hall with a live orchestra playing the score alongside the movie, and that was quite electric. By now, my initial antipathy towards Jedi had stabilised to acceptance and now a grudging like. It's just that it could have been a little bit better. There were people involved in the production at the time who didn't think much of the script for Star Wars Return of the Jedi. There are people who never liked the Ewoks, and of course there are people who love the Ewoks. While working on the script, George Lucas had said to his director and his co-writer that he wanted to make a kids movie. So it's clear at this point there's not as much of a leap to the prequels, whatever you thought of those, as you could clearly see Lucas pitching Star Wars as a kid-first franchise even in 1983. By the 1990s, Lucas was starting to see a lot of the problems that he'd often wrestled with being solved by computer-based systems. That was editing video, editing audio, organising productions, and most especially generating special effects. In Return of the Jedi, there's some limited CG used for view screens and the projector. ILM's breakthroughs with CG in the early 1990s sparked George Lucas into fishing out his collection of filmmaking beards and continue with the Star Wars saga. But first, he thought about using the new technology to clean up the trilogy and fix a lot of things that had bugged him. In 1997, the special editions were released in theatres, all of which were big hits again. That's not to say people didn't have thoughts about some of the changes and additions. We've talked about the changes for the first two films, changes that would be added to with each subsequent re-release of the film on a new format. But for Jedi, any changes didn't alter the story all that much. The blinking Ewoks were now actual blinking Ewoks, and Vader's internal conflict was a little more obvious. But the two biggest changes were made on the musical side. In Jabba's palace, Cy Snoodles had sung a song called Lapti Nek, and now we had a much bigger song, Jedi Rock, which was a hybrid of a Stax or Motown-style song. And with that, it's certainly using up this week's allocation of tokens on the cringe platform, Wins Flinch. The end of the film originally saw a quick celebration in the Ewok village. And now there's an entirely different instrumental playing over scenes of celebrations in different parts of the Empire. As parts of those running changes, there'd be even more tweaks after the completion of the prequel trilogy, most notably and perhaps most egregiously, swapping out Sebastian Shaw's Force Ghost with that of Hayden Christensen circa Revenge of the Sith.
Come on, let's keep a little optimism.
On its release in May of 1983, Jedi was another huge smash, becoming the biggest box office earner of the year, though its original release earned a little less than Empire had. As it was the final film in the trilogy, there were perhaps fewer takers for repeat cinema viewings, and when all of the various releases and re-releases of the original trilogy were totaled, Jedi would consistently earn less than its two predecessors. It does wrap a lot of things up in this original trilogy. Years later, a prequel trilogy saw George Lucas once again don his directing beard, where he would tell the story of Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader, which held to a lot of his original story outlines, but also embellished them in several ways that do conflict with what was established in the original trilogy. That's just pish-posh. Return of the Jedi is also pish-posh of a sort.
Why didn't you tell me?
But it's full of adventure and excitement, and while those boring-ass Jedi may not crave that, I do. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Would you get going, you pirate?